The night was thick with the scent of candle wax and damp stone. Shadows clung to the corners of the medieval church, their shapes shifting with each flicker of the flame. The wind outside moaned through the high, narrow windows, but it was not the wind that drew the priest's eyes toward the altar. It was the sound faint at first, as though the building itself were sighing in its sleep. A scratching, a scraping, then a muffled cry. The priest froze, the heavy iron key still in his hand. He glanced toward the massive oak doors, bolted now against the darkness of the outside world. His fingers tightened around the crucifix that hung at his breast, as though its cold metal could still the tremor rising in his chest. Slowly, with a movement that betrayed both fear and habit, he knelt before the altar. The candles flared and guttered as though stirred by some unseen breath. His lips moved in prayer, the Latin syllables tumbling out in a whisper. Yet his eyes betrayed him, darting again toward the flagstones beneath his knees. The noises did not stop. They seemed to come from deep below, from the very earth the church rested upon. With each sound, the mind's eye could imagine what the stone concealed. The earth shifted, the gravel settled, and within the silence between the scratches was the unbearable certainty that someone's something was there. The priest pressed his forehead to the cold floor, as if willing himself not to hear. His prayers grew louder, desperate now, drowning out the feeble noises rising from the depths. If one could peel back the centuries, if one could look beneath that ancient floor, the truth would seep out like a long-forgotten wound, down there. In the dark hollow beneath the altar lay the small, contorted remains of children. Their bones, no larger than a man's finger, lay in twisted patterns as if they had struggled until the very end. Some were curled tightly, others sprawled, their tiny jaws open in a scream that had never reached the air above. The stone kept its secrets well. The parishioners who came to kneel in that same spot felt only the chill of the flagstones, never the memory they concealed. Their whispered confessions mingled with the whispers beneath their feet, though only one was meant for God's ears. And yet, what greater contradiction could there be? This placement to cradle the weary, heal the broken, shelter the lost had become a tomb, a sanctuary that doubled as a prison. The church's bells had called the faithful to prayer for centuries, never revealing that the sound echoed above. Those who had been silenced forever. The narrator's voice, soft and deliberate, cuts through the scene like a slow turn of the knife. Why, in a place where holy water washed away sin, did the smallest and most innocent meet their end in darkness? There are stories, of course, whispers in old records, rumors passed through generations, half believed even by those who repeated them. The children were buried here to protect the building's foundation, their spirits bound to guard the church. That some were laid to rest as an offering to guard a grim, misguided attempt to buy divine favor. Others suggest less mystical motives, that these were the unwanted, the illegitimate, the inconvenient. That stone was kinder than scandal. The camera lingers on the priest's hands, clasped so tightly the knuckles whiten. He does not open his eyes, does not dare to look at the stones that separate the living from the dead. The scratching grows fainter, replaced by a deep and pressing silence, as though whatever stirs beneath has given up hope of being heard in that stillness. The candlelight dances across the carved saints who watch from their niches along the walls. Their painted eyes seem heavy with something that is not quite pity, not quite judgment. The church is quiet now, and yet the air seems charged with an unspoken truth, faith. The narrator reminds us, has been the refuge of the human soul for 1,000 years. But faith has also been the hand that closed the door, that pressed the stone into place, that whispered the prayers while the air ran out below. The screen fades to black, leaving the final words hanging in the darkness. In places meant to save us, why did some find only the weight of the stone? In the heart of the medieval world, no soil was more coveted than that which lay beneath the floor of a church. To be buried here where incense curled in the air, where chants rose heavenward, each dawn was to rest in ground believed to be permanently blessed, saturated with the prayers of centuries. It was not just an honor for kings or saints. In the minds of the faithful, it was a shortcut to salvation. For the medieval Christian, the afterlife loomed closer than the next harvest. Life was fragile. Plague, famine, and war made the grave seem only a heartbeat away. The Church taught that proximity to sacred relics, altars, and holy rites could speed the journey of the soul toward eternal peace. The closer the body to the altar, the greater the spiritual advantage. This belief seeped into every class of society, from noble lords to humble peasants, and among the most desired of all souls to place in such ground were those of children. Children, in the theology of the age, were viewed as near pure vessels. Though original sin clung to them, baptism had washed away its stain, leaving their innocence almost unblemished. Priests often described them as lambs of God, unsullied by the temptations that plagued adults. It was believed their very presence sanctified the earth around them. To bury a child beneath a church was thought to be not only a mercy for that child's soul, but a blessing for the building itself. The practice was not restricted to the wealthy, though the rich often claimed the choicest spots near the chancel or choir. Poor families would plead, bargain, or work for months to secure even a small corner beneath the nave. Some mothers were said to wrap the bodies of their infants in linen, placing a tiny carved cross in their hands before laying them in shallow graves dug into the packed earth below the wooden pews. In such moments, grief and faith intertwined so tightly that one could scarcely tell them apart. But here is where the whisper turns cold. Not every child who went beneath the church floor was lifeless. Legends, preserved in the margins of parish records and in the murmurs of local folklore, tell of children entombed not because they had died, but because they were believed to be destined for death. A wasting illness, a high fever, a deformity, or even an illumined birth could lead to a grim decision. Some parents, convinced their child's soul would be spared suffering in purgatory, acted before death arrived naturally. To them, the act was not murder, it was salvation. In one 14th century account from the Low Countries, a mother is said to have brought her pale, trembling daughter to the church at dusk, insisting the priest perform last rites. The girl, still conscious, was lowered into a niche by the crypt wall, surrounded by holy water and relics. The mother wept as the priest sealed the stone. In her mind, she had not abandoned her child to darkness, she had given her to God's eternal light. Rumors like these were never spoken openly in the marketplace or from the pulpit, yet they persisted. Some clerics themselves were accused of quietly condoning the practice, reasoning that the child's soul would ascend untainted if it died in the holiest of places. A handful of surviving ecclesiastical decrees, particularly in rural dioceses, seem almost coded warning against placing the living among the dead, without ever stating outright what was being prohibited. The paradox is stark, the same. Church that proclaimed itself the refuge of the innocent could, under the weight of superstition and fear, become the site of their suffocation. The altar, symbol of divine mercy, cast a shadow deep enough to hide such acts from the sunlit conscience of the village. And yet, not all these burials, live or dead, were acts of cruelty born from desperation. In a society where medicine faltered and death's touch was swift, the idea of securing one's child's place in heaven before it was too late felt, too many, like the highest form of love. The image is haunting, a grieving parent kneeling in prayer as the sound of a stone slab being set in place echoes through the dim nave, the candlelight flickering over their face. Their tears are real, so is their faith. But faith, in the medieval world, was rarely simple. It was a tapestry of scripture and superstition, charity and fear, mercy and sacrifice. Beneath its most radiant threads lay the darker weave, justified by salvation, yet forever shadowed by the silence they left behind. And so, the ground beneath those churches filled, not just with the bodies of the dead, but with the weight of choices made in the name of eternity. Beneath the soaring arches of a medieval church, where every stone seemed to hum with centuries of prayer, lay another, far darker architecture, one not designed to lift the soul toward heaven, but to hide the dead from living eyes. To the common worshipper, the floor was simply the floor, solid, sacred, and eternal. But to those who knew its secrets, the masons, the priests, and the sextons, it was a carefully engineered skin stretched over a labyrinth of chambers, crypts, and OSS, UARIES. In some churches, the entrance to these underworlds was hidden beneath heavy flagstones near the altar, their seams worn smooth by the feet of countless supplicants. Others were tucked behind narrow, unlit corridors, their doors disguised as part of the wall paneling. Inside lay stone-lined pits, often no larger than a child's bed, yet deep enough to swallow a body whole. Archaeological excavations have revealed how some were sealed in a matter of minutes. A slab slid into place, mortar quickly smeared, and all sound from below muffled by the chanting above. Medieval builders understood sound as much as structure. The same vaulted ceilings that magnified the softest whisper of prayer also carried other noises, less holy through the nave. Accounts from later centuries describe strange thumps, faint, sobbing, or scratching noises heard during late-night vigils. Such stories were often dismissed as superstitious nonsense or the devil's tricks. But for those who have examined the cold stone vaults today, it is not hard to imagine how a single human cry could echo up into the rafters before fading into silence. Osiris the bone rooms were perhaps the most unsettling part of this. Subterranean design. Unlike the orderly graveyards outside, ossuaries were chaotic, heaped with skulls and femurs stacked into rough walls. In some churches, these rooms adjoined burial vaults where newly deceased bodies were interred until the flesh decayed, at which point the bones were removed to make room for others. These vaults did not discriminate between adult and child, saint or sinner, but occasionally the smaller skeletons discovered there told a more troubling story. Not all of them bore the signs of long illness or peaceful passing. One 14th century parish record from Burgundy described the special pit dug beneath the side chapel. Close enough to feel the saint's grace, it was not marked on any public map of the church, and only the senior clergy knew the exact location. Testimonies suggest it could be reached quickly from the sacristy during a service. The slab lifted without interrupting the Mass. A small body could be placed inside and covered before the congregation noticed. Such efficiency was not solely a matter of devotion, it was a matter of control. These hidden spaces allowed the church to manage death discreetly. In times of plague, Secrecy prevented panic. In times of scandal, it erased unwanted questions. And in the most disturbing cases, whispered through village gossip, it provided a place for sacrifices no one dared acknowledge. The paradox of these spaces is what chills the modern mind. The very architecture that embraced worshippers in divine music was also capable of swallowing life into silence. The choir's voices would rise toward heaven, while perhaps beneath their very feet another voice dwindled into nothing. Even now, when archaeologists open a long-sealed vault, they sometimes find the bones jumbled and incomplete, mixed in ways that defy the neat order of planned burial. Small hands clenched into fists, jawbones frozen in a final open cry. It is here that the boundary between sacred ground and a hidden tomb dissolves, leaving only the cold, unyielding stone the last witness to what happened in the shadows beneath. The prayers the medieval world held an unshakable belief in the spiritual potency of the young. Children, in their perceived innocence, were thought to exist halfway between the earthly realm and the divine. Theologians preached that their souls, uncorrupted by sin, ascended directly into heaven like smoke from a candle, pure and untainted. Within this framework, the death of a child was not only a personal tragedy, but also a sacred event, a moment wrapped in mysticism. Church sermons often painted these little ones as holy innocents, drawing from the biblical story of King Herod's massacre in Bethlehem. Priests compared the children of their own time to those martyred infants victims. Yes, but also chosen souls whose deaths were woven into God's mysterious design. It was an idea that soothed grieving parents and gave a sense of divine purpose to their loss. But as with many beliefs in the Middle Ages, what began as comfort could be twisted into something far darker. In certain regions, whispers circulated that to die within the consecrated walls of a church was to be embraced instantly by heaven. The closer to the altar, the better. This belief, while often applied to the sick and elderly, took on a more unsettling form when applied to children. If their souls were already destined for paradise, why not ensure their passage from the holiest place possible? Why leave it to chance, when one could arrange for their last breath to be drawn beneath a vaulted ceiling where the saints looked down? Most parents, of course, did not think in such terms. The idea of intentionally ending a child's life was abhorrent. But in an age when infant mortality was staggering and death shadowed every family, desperation could distort morality. Some historians have suggested that, in rare and extreme cases, grief-stricken parents, on by certain clerics, might have agreed to end a child's suffering by placing them in the care of the church, knowing they might never emerge alive. This is where the line between devotion and atrocity begins to blur. Chroniclers in monastic records occasionally hint at special interments, described with curious euphemisms. One 14th century entry from a Benedictine priory speaks of the little one received into the womb of the Mother Church before the angels. Hand closed his eyes. Was this poetic description simply of a child's burial, an oblique reference to something more immediate, more intentional? The darker speculation comes from fragmented folklore and whispered accusations preserved in town archives. In some towns, rumors spoke of blessing the foundation of a new chapel with the life of a pure soul, ensuring its protection and prosperity. The practice, if it ever happened, would have been a grim echo of ancient pagan rites where human lives were offered to sanctify sacred ground. Christianity outwardly rejected such acts, but the human tendency to mingle superstition with faith could never be fully erased. Art of the period offers an unsettling counterpoint. Frescoes and illuminated manuscripts often depicted children in the arms of angels, rising toward golden light. Yet these same churches sometimes hid beneath their floors a collection of tiny bones-mute reminders of mortality, sealed away in darkness. To the worshipper gazing upward, the imagery was comforting. To the one who knew what lay below, it could be haunting. Some clergy defended the practice of placing gravely ill children beneath the church floor, claiming it was an act of mercy. Death in the sanctity of God's house, they argued, was not cruelty but the highest gift, saving the child from the world's suffering and ensuring eternal bliss. They spoke of it in tender tones, their words laced with scripture, yet such justifications, no matter how pious in language, mask an undeniable horror, a life cut short not by fate, but by human hands. We must remember that the medieval church was not a monolith of virtue or vice. There were compassionate priests who fought fiercely for the protection of the vulnerable, just as there were those who exploited belief for power or control. The secrecy surrounding certain deaths in consecrated spaces makes it impossible to know how many were the result of true accident, how many of disease, and how many, if any, were deliberate offerings. What is clear is that the belief in holy proximity at the moment of death provided both comfort and cover. Comfort for those who simply wanted their loved ones as close to God as possible in burial. Cover for those whose actions were the born of desperation. Misguided piety, or something more sinister, would otherwise be unthinkable. The paradox is chilling. Faith as a shield for innocence, and faith as a silent witness to its destruction. The medieval mind found ways to reconcile both, weaving them into the same tapestry of devotion. For the grieving, the image of their child walking hand in hand with an angel into heaven was a balm too precious to abandon. For the opportunist, it was a perfect justification, and so the churches stood, echoing with hymns that praised divine mercy, while beneath their stones lay the unanswered questions. Were these children truly holy innocents, casualties of the age's fragility, or were they, in rare and hidden cases, human offerings, lives traded for blessings no mortal could grant? The answer lies somewhere in the shadows between history and rumor, between theology and superstition, and in that dim space, the stones still whisper. By the mid-14th century, the Black Death had torn through Europe like a scythe in a wheat field, leaving entire villages abandoned and cities choking on the stench of their own dead. Streets became rivers of sorrow, where carts groaned under the weight of bodies wrapped in hastily sewn shrouds. Bells tolled without pause, their notes blurring into a single, endless dirge. In this suffocating climate of fear, the church was not only a sanctuary, it became the final repository for thousands. Altars, once reserved for sacraments, now presided over the endless procession of the dying. Stone floors grew slick with candle wax, and the faint sheen of moisture rising from the crypts below, where corpses were stacked in narrow vaults like firewood in a cellar. The air hung heavy with incense, not for worship, but to mask the reek of decay. It was in this atmosphere of relentless death that one of the most disturbing chapters of medieval burial practice emerged. Records from parish accounts and civic decrees reveal chilling hints. To seal the vault with haste, the child still moving, that pestilence be halted. It was phrased delicately, but the implication is unmistakable. Sick children, their breathing ragged but not yet ceased, were lowered into burial chambers and entombed alongside the already dead. The justification was as pragmatic as it was monstrous. Disease was poorly understood. Invisible miasmas were thought to rise from the sick, spreading like poison in the air, to stop the rot before it could consume an entire household. The ailing were sometimes given over to the church's keeping alive. Parents, torn between terror of the plague and the instinct to protect their child, could be persuaded that this was an act of mercy. Better to let the child pass within holy ground, under the vaulted arches where angels were believed to linger, than to die writhing in a filthy alley. Inside the crypts, the architecture that once amplified chants now gave unnatural volume to muffled cries. A faint voice could carry upward through stone vents and into the sanctuary above, merging with the drone of prayers. In some accounts, priests claimed the sounds were not screams at all, but the angelic whisper of the soul leaving the body. Such interpretations soothed the congregation and, perhaps, the conscience of those who had ordered the sealing. The plague years blurred the boundaries between piety and panic, salvation and slaughter. Outside, chaos reigned. Physicians in beaked masks moved like omens through the crowd, their pouches of herbs swinging with each step. Neighbors avoided one another's gaze, fearful of seeing the shadow of illness in familiar faces. Yet within the church walls, death was ordered, ritualized, and at least to those who sanctioned it sanctified. And still, the rumor persisted that not all entombments were born of desperation. Some whispered that a child's death within consecrated ground, especially during times of pestilence, could act as a spiritual bulwark, turning aside the wrath of God from the parish. Whether born of superstition or a darker theology, these murmurs added a sinister undertone to every hurried burial. In the years following the worst waves of plague, when the air cleared and the bells grew silent once more, new generations would kneel on the very stones that sealed these crypts. They would pray for deliverance, never knowing that beneath their knees lay not only victims of disease, but those sacrificed to its fear. And the church, in its silence, kept its secrets well in dusty corners of European archives and under the careful brushes of archaeologists. Truth emerges, merges, but in stone and bone. This section of the tale leaves behind the realm of rumor and superstition to stand upon the solid, if chilling, ground of evidence. It is here, in the cold soil of England, France, and Germany, that the past exhales its secrets. One such secret came to light beneath a parish church in Norfolk, England. At first, the excavation seemed routine part of a conservation project before structural repairs. Beneath the nave's floor, workers found a cluster of small skeletons, their bones, arranged in ways that puzzled the team. One child lay curled as if asleep, knees drawn up to the chest. Another's arm was twisted behind its back in a position almost impossible to achieve after death. But the most haunting detail was the stone surface above them, faint, frantic. Scratches, shallow but numerous, as though made by small fingernails. The archaeologists paused, the air in the chamber thick with a silence that felt accusatory. Similar evidence surfaced hundreds of miles away in a rural French village, where a long-forgotten ossuary was unearthed during the renovation of a medieval chapel. The vault was narrow, its walls close enough to press against the shoulders of even a small child. The skeletons there were not neatly laid out, but haphazard, some face down, others tangled together. One tiny skull bore signs of cranial trauma not from a weapon, but from repeated contact with stone. The local records, sparse but telling, spoke of a purification rite during a plague year, where those nearest to God were sent ahead to plead for mercy. It was written in careful, almost reverent script, as if the scribe believed the act righteous. Germany's Black Forest yielded another grim testimony. In the ruins of a chapel that had collapsed centuries ago, archaeologists discovered what they first assumed was a communal grave. But under the scrutiny of forensic anthropologists, patterns emerged. The majority of the remains were of children aged between 4 and 8. Their bones unusually well preserved in the damp earth. Several skeletons had hands positioned awkwardly. In front of their faces, the fingers flexed as though in warding. Even more disturbing were the remnants of cloth fragments, simple wool tunics, still clinging to the ribs bearing no signs of decay consistent with long illness. These were not the garments of plague victims wasting away in bed. They were everyday clothes, worn at the time of burial. In each of these cases, science replaced supposition with undeniable clarity. Scratch marks, unnatural bone positions, and clothing remnants told stories no chronicler dared to write in full. Yet the echo of these children's final moments reverberates through the details. The historian's pen may be hesitant, but the bones have no such restraint. What strikes the modern mind most sharply is not simply the violence of these deaths, but the framework that allowed them. These were not the actions of wild mobs or criminals in the shadows. They happened in consecrated ground, under roofs meant to shelter the faithful. In England, parish ledgers hinted at small donations to the church following certain burials, sums too large to represent an ordinary fee for the dead. In France, one priest's marginal note in a missal spoke cryptically of sealing the prayers in the walls, perhaps an oblique reference to those interred alive. In Germany, a 15th-century sermon fragment urged parents to send their lambs into the fold before the wolves come, a metaphor that, in light of the archaeology, feels far less poetic. It is easy, perhaps, to imagine such acts as rare or isolated. Yet the consistency of these findings across countries and centuries forces a darker conclusion that the practice, if not common, was at least known. And if it was known, then it was, at some level, accepted. Forensic science can only go so far. Marks may tell us that a child tried to escape, but not the exact moment when their cries faded. Twisted limbs may suggest a body's struggle, but not the face that looked down upon them as the final stone was laid. Still, the cumulative weight of the evidence builds a silent chorus, one that has waited for centuries to be heard. The dead do not lie not in the sense of deception. Their bodies speak with a truth uncolored by moral justification or theological argument. They tell us that beneath the hymns and incense, beneath the sermons about love and salvation, there was another story, a story carved in the bone, written in scratches, sealed in stone, and once heard. That story cannot be forgotten in medieval Europe. The church was not only a spiritual refuge, was also a political fortress. From the soaring cathedrals of France to the weathered parish chapels of rural England, ecclesiastical authority intertwined with the ambitions of kings, dukes, and barons. Beneath the incense-scented air and stained glass glow, power was bartered, secured, and sometimes quite literally buried in stone. The interment of children beneath church floors, while wrapped in the veil of sacred tradition, could serve more earthly and ruthless purposes. For noble patrons, the church was both ally and shield. A bishop who owed his rise to a wealthy benefactor could ensure that inconvenient scandals never reached the ears of rival courts. When a child stood in the way of an inheritancer, younger half-brother to a newly crowned duke, an illegitimate offspring of a baron, or even the sole heir of a contested estate, placing that child within the protection of the church could mean far more than spiritual guidance. In whispered corridors, arrangements were made. The child might be brought to the church under the guise of sanctuary, baptism, or special blessing. What happened after the heavy doors closed often left no written record. Political murders, especially of noble blood, were dangerous when done in the open. But the death of a child in the hallowed interior of a chapel could be framed as divine will. No jury would question the word of an abbot who claimed the young one had been taken by God during prayer, and when burial took place beneath the altar or within a sealed crypt, it was less an act of commemoration than one of concealment. In regions like Burgundy and Saxony, rumors persisted that certain monastic orders acted as discreet enforcers for their patrons. Chroniclers spoke obliquely of unfortunate youths who vanished after being placed under a monastery's guardianship. Excavations in some of these same regions, centuries later, revealed child remains layered beneath floors where no official records of burial existed. Some skeletons bore jewelry or insignia, suggesting noble birthed objects that should have been passed on to heirs, but were instead locked away with the bodies in eternal silence. The church hierarchy itself benefited from these arrangements. By aligning with secular power, bishops and abbots secured land grants, tax exemptions, and military protection. In return, they offered their cathedrals as sanctuaries not only for souls, but for secrets. When a dispute arose over succession, a sudden death within the cathedral walls could tip the balance toward a favored claimant. The loss of a child, especially one poised to inheritly shaped dynastic futures in an instant sometimes. The political motive extended beyond inheritance. A charismatic youth from a rival family could inspire popular support that threatened both lord and bishop. Removing such a figure quietly and framing the loss as a holy tragedy ensured that grief would be mingled with awe rather than outrage. In this way, the very architecture of faith became a weapon: stone walls that muffled cries, burial vaults that erased inconvenient lives, and altars that sanctified what might otherwise be called murder. Publicly, church leaders projected sanctity. Processions, relic displays, and charity toward the poor reinforced their image as guardians of morality. But behind this facade, the same men might oversee clandestine arrangements that served the ambitions of princes or the grudges of dukes. The dual role of the church, both moral compass and political broker, created an environment where justice bent easily to the needs of the powerful. This dark convergence of faith and politics ensured that certain deaths would never be questioned, and certain graves would never be marked. The floor of a medieval church could conceal more than saints sit, could hide the casualties of dynastic ambition. And as the candles flickered during evening mass, those in attendance might never suspect that beneath their feet lay the silent victims of a pact between mitre and crown. Survivors of the silent burials, such a term can even be applied. Rarely those who had been intended as victims. Rather, they were the witnesses, the peripheral souls who saw, heard, or intuited what had happened but could never speak. In the shadowed world of medieval Christendom, where the church stood as the ultimate arbiter of truth and morality, to question its actions was to risk not only damnation in the next life, but ruin in this one. A surviving sibling might have noticed the sudden absence of a brother or sister, the hurried explanation offered by parents, or the whispered reassurances that the child had gone to God. Sometimes these absences were explained through pious euphemism chosen by the angels. Called early to the Lord's service, children, with their half-formed understanding of mortality, could be convinced to accept such phrases, though some would grow into adulthood, haunted by the knowledge that the truth was darker. In some rare chilling cases, older siblings had seen the preparations, the dressing in white, the rosary placed in tiny hands, the candlelit procession toward the church. Among altar boys, the trauma could be sharper still. They might be ordered to hold torches during a midnight interment, to carry small relics or holy water. Their roles reduced to ceremonial functionaries in a rite they did not understand but sensed was wrong. Their silence was not simply encouraged, was commanded, often with stern reminders that to speak is to blaspheme, or to question God's will is to invite the devil into your soul. These boys would grow into men who carried the secret like a stone lodged in the chest, its weight pressing heavier each year. Even some members of the clergy bore the same burden. Not all priests or monks believed in the necessity or righteousness of such burials. Some entered the priesthood in search of a holy life, only to find themselves complicit in acts they could neither prevent nor expose. The church's hierarchical structure ensured that responsibility and blame flowed downward in ways that trapped those at the bottom. To protest was to risk accusations of heresy, a charge that could end in excommunication or execution. A priest who spoke out risked not only his own life, but the spiritual welfare of his parish, for the church could withdraw sacraments, marriages, and burials in retaliation. Medieval society possessed a remarkable capacity to sanctify suffering, a trait often framed as piety but which, in practice, could serve as a smokescreen for cruelty. Pain was believed to purify the soul. Sacrifice, whether voluntary or forced, was held up as the highest form of devotion. This worldview made it easier to justify silence. To speak against the church was to question God's inscrutable plan. To speak for the dead risked being branded a tool of the devil. And so, silence became a communal act. Villagers who had their suspicions stayed quiet because they needed the church's blessings, its protection, and its intercession in times of famine or plague. Mothers and fathers who lost children in these rites might grieve in private but never openly accuse. In some cases, they might even try to believe the official explanation, forcing themselves to see the act as a holy offering rather than a theft. This collective denial allowed horrors to persist for generations. Without testimony, without records, the dead could not speak until centuries later, when archaeologists began to uncover the truth beneath stone floors. But for the survivors who lived and died in the Middle Ages, the burden of knowing remained a private torment. Dreams might replay the muffled cries they had once overheard, or they might imagine the darkness closing in on a small, terrified face. In an age where confession was a sacred act, such memories were often confessed, not for absolution, but to bury them more deeply in secrecy. The silence, in the end, was as much a tomb as the stone vaults beneath the churches. Those who kept it became its custodians, guarding a darkness they could never dispel. And when they themselves were lowered into consecrated earth, the weight of that silence was buried with them till the day the earth itself began to give up its dead. The first shovelful of earth is always deceptively light. Archaeologists know that what lies beneath might be nothing more than stones and dust, or it might be the kind of truth that unsettles entire narratives. In the last century, dozens of excavations across Europe have revealed the hidden and often unspoken legacy of medieval child burials beneath church floors. These findings are not only academic curiosities. They are intimate confrontations with the choices and beliefs of a world gone by. It often begins with a routine restoration, an old chapel being reinforced, a crypt floor relayed. Workers lift flagstones that have been undisturbed for centuries. And there, in the dim air, lies the outline of a small skeleton. At first, it's a moment of quiet reverence. Then the specialists are called in, and the careful work begins. Brushes sweep centuries of dust from tiny ribs. Gloved hands lift delicate bones no thicker than twigs. But sometimes, the arrangement of those bones tells a story the official parish records never did. In one English parish, a dig beneath the chancel revealed the remains of 3 children laid side by side, their heads tilted toward each other. In a posture of fear, 2 had arm bones twisted unnaturally, likely from struggling in the narrow confines of their grave. Scratch marks, faint but undeniable, scored the limestone lining. No parish ledger mentioned their deaths. No monument bore their names. The burial was deliberate but silent, secret transaction between those who placed them there and the stones that hid them. In France, forensic teams uncovered a crypt where several child skeletons bore traces of respiratory distress. Deformed from long-term illness, they were interred in ways that suggested their deaths came not from natural progression but from being sealed away. Soil analysis revealed that the crypt had been filled and refilled over decades, the remains compacted together without the care given to noble burials above. In Germany, ground-penetrating radar led investigators to an unmarked chamber beneath a cathedral. When opened, the air was stale but intact, preserving a scene both haunting and meticulous. Children's bodies had been arranged in almost ceremonial fashion, each with a small wooden cross placed upon the chest, yet the crosses were rough, hastily carved, as though the ritual were meant to appease witnesses rather than honor the dead. Carbon dating placed them in the late 14th century, peak time for plague and political instability. Forensic science has become the voice these children never had. Scratch patterns inside burial chambers reveal last struggles. Mineral deposits on bone hint at the damp and airless conditions in which they spent their final moments. Twists in limb placement tell of frantic movement after interment. Modern analysis of isotopes in teeth can trace where a child was born and whether they were malnourished. Facts that speak volumes about the desperation or neglect that shaped their fate. Historians, too, find themselves caught between fascination and grief. Every unearthed body is a question. Who decided this? Who watched it happen? Who kept silent? Church archives rarely answer. Many are missing, some deliberately purged during later centuries to erase uncomfortable records. What remains are fragments, cryptic notes in parish margins, testimonies from witchcraft trials where whispers of buried alive surface as accusations. The contrast between then and now could not be sharper. In the medieval world, the act of burial, however brutal, was framed as a form of spiritual intervention, a way to save souls or protect the living. Today, the process of exhumation is governed by ethics, respect, and scientific precision. Remains are documented, studied, and then reinterred with ceremony. Modern clergy sometimes stand alongside archaeologists during reburials, reading prayers over bones their predecessors once entombed in silence. Yet even as the past is brought into the light, there's an unease that lingers. These excavations are not just about bones, they are about dismantling the illusions of an age-long romanticized for its faith and piety. The medieval mind was capable of deep devotion and equally deep cruelty, often in the same act. Each grave opened today forces the living to wrestle with how belief can be used to sanctify violence, how fear can warp morality, and how silence can let it all endure. And so, The slow exhumation of truth continues, not just in the soil, but in the conscience. The stones that once sealed away the cries of children now give them a second voice, one that crosses centuries. It is a voice that says, "We were here, we suffered, and we must be remembered." The church stood in silence, its walls soaked in centuries of whispered prayers and unspoken sins. Moonlight sifted through high, narrow windows, spilling pale beams. Across the cold flagstones, the nave, so grand in daylight, now seemed cavernous and watchful, its shadows deep, its stillness absolute. Every sound, even the faint settling of the timbers, felt amplified in the hush. Here, the past did not sleep. It lingered. Somewhere beneath these stones lay the tiny remains of children wrapped in shrouds, placed in hollowed spaces, sealed away with prayers meant to cleanse the living of fear. They had been offered not to God, but to the human need for control over chaos, to the cruel belief that the sacrifice of a few might safeguard the many. It was a belief dressed in liturgy, perfumed with incense, given the voice of Scripture, yet at its core, it was the same old story of fear-feeding cruelty. The narrator's voice softens, tracing the outline of this truth in the great ledger of human history. Righteousness has often been the ink in which our worst acts are written. The clergy who presided over these burials might have spoken of mercy, the parents might have told themselves it was necessary, and the survivors, those who lived on, carrying the memory, might have found ways to turn recollection into prayer. But the stones remembered more than they ever confessed. Even now, as archaeologists lift these slabs and find the bones beneath, there is a moment of hesitation before the truth is touched. In that hesitation, the echo of the nave seems to breathe, as though the building itself is listening. The narrator pauses, letting the listener imagine it. A single candle flickering in the apse, shadows climbing the columns like silent penitents, the air thick with the scent of old stone and older dust. In such a place, it is possible to feel both the grandeur of faith and the gravity of its betrayals. And so the question rises not from the pulpit, but from the floor itself. How many stones remain untouched? How many other voices lie trapped, unheard, beneath the sanctuaries we revere? The nave offers no answer, only the faint sense that somewhere, something is waiting. The final words fall like a closing door. We walk on history every day, but some histories are not ready to let us go, and some stones still keep their secrets